I'm Patrick Pacheco. Coming up on Theater All the Moving Parts, a chat with Rick Ellis of Jersey Boys and The Cher Show about the challenges of musical book writing. I'm Patrick Pacheco. Welcome to this virtual episode of Theater All the Moving Parts about musical book writing, one of the least understood and most difficult of crafts. My guest is Rick Ellis, who most recently wrote The Cher Show, and who previously co-wrote with Marshall Brickman, Jersey Boys, and The Addams Family. Welcome, Rick. It's good to be with you.
Welcome, Patrick. It's very good to be with you, although we're not with each other, but I feel very close to you at this moment. So
I always feel close to you, Rick. Rick, most people don't know what a book writer does. What is job number one when it comes to this all-important craft?
Well, if you find somebody who knows the answer to that question, please have them call me. Peter Stone, the great late Peter Stone, would have said it's negotiating by tantrum. The late, great Arthur Lawrence probably would have said it's rewriting. Writing for the theater is rewriting, he said, I think, maybe to me. And for me, job number one is, as I get older and I get more involved in various projects, I realize that it's having an organizing principle. Part of that is going to be passion. I don't think it's useful to write about something that you don't have some real drive to write about, or some idea that fuels you as you go through a process that's likely going to take years. But that's emotional. The intellectual part of it is an organizing principle, which is going to inform what you include and what you exclude from the vast source of ideas and material that's probably connected to your story. But of course, at the end of the day, the very most important thing is story. Do you have a good story, and do you have compelling characters? And if you do, then get to work. And if you don't, then don't take any calls until you actually find them.
What people don't understand, and what they basically think the book is the dialogue between songs.
Oh, dialogue.
But in fact, you're responsible often for the concept, for the tone, for so many other things that are involved in book writing.
Well, that for me is the fun. I spent 20 years working as a creative director at an advertising agency, because it turned out that this thing that I had been doing all my life, which was having ideas, it turned out to be something that I could make a living at. So I thought, oh, I guess I'll do that. Just sort of, backing into everything as I've done in my life. But the pleasure of having ideas, for that to be your profession as well as your avocation, is a great privilege. And so I think that the big idea, in terms of structure, the concept, those are the things that are really attractive to me. And those are the things that are the very first building blocks to any production. Once you have that organizing principle that I described, then you can apply that to various concepts, sort of shake them around and see what holds up. And dialogue is the very, very last thing you do. When I'm collaborating, we usually take long walks in Central Park, except today because there's 12 feet of snow. But usually you take long, long walks and talk things into existence, which is a great pleasure. But if you're working alone, which is sometimes the case, you talk to yourself and you talk things into existence that way. But the dialogue is the very, very last thing I think that comes along. I'm not so strict on outlines and index cards and the sort of the beat sheet Hollywood model of story structure, which is fine. And if I'm working with collaborators who like to work that way, that's fine with me. But sometimes it's nice to just think elliptically and free associate.
Of course, we're talking about musical book writing, and you mentioned two of the greatest musical book writers, Peter Stone, who wrote 1776 and Titanic, and also Arthur Lawrence, who wrote the book to Gypsy. What are some of the other gold standards of musical book writing in your canon?
Well, I mean, the credit of Peters that I would mention at the top of his list, 'cause he did so much, and of course he also wrote lots of films, was 1776, because you think, well, what could be drier than a history lesson on stage? And we all now think of Hamilton as the gold standard when it comes to bringing our political life to life. But Peter Stone did it in 1969, I think, and did it really magnificently without anybody else in the room, because the music and lyrics had been written, and that fellow had passed away, so there's literally nobody else for him to talk to. He just figured out a way to do it that made it thrilling. So I would include that. Arthur's work, of course, on Gypsy and West Side are great. The other late, great Hugh Wheeler wrote A Little Night Music and Sweeney Todd with Steve Sondheim. And of course, those are two wonderful musicals. And I think that Mr. Sondheim would be the first to say a large part of what makes them great is the organization and the scene work of Hugh Wheeler, who incidentally was very involved in the film of Cabaret, which is maybe the great movie musical of the last century.
And Joe Masteroff, who wrote the book to the stage musical of Cabaret.
What's heartbreaking is that before every one of these names, you could put the late great. And here I am merely late. So, I aspire to what these men and women have done. I think the great books that are not instantly springing to mind are great because the book writer usually takes the back seat when it comes to greatness. The great musicals are remembered generally for their music and lyrics. They're generally remembered for the auteur directorial stamp, the concept. Even if that comes from the book writer, it's assumed to come from the director. The great design, all of the visual feast for the eyes aspect of some musicals that people adore. But very rarely do you hear someone say, oh, I've got to go see that new musical by a book writer, because it just doesn't seem to be the way it works.
And so much of the book is cannibalized, so to speak, by the songwriters. Sondheim is very, very clear about the fact that he took Hugh Wheeler's scenes and then just wrote them into a song.
Yes.
And the lyrics to those songs were so much.
And that's exactly how it should work. They call it eating the book. And that's fine. It's absolutely fine, because what you get to do in exchange for being so self-effacing as a writer is you get to be in the room where it happened. You should pardon the expression.
Right.
A phrase created by a book writer. You mentioned people think the book is the dialogue. Even people who should know better, like let's say a former critic for the New York Times, who when Hamilton was nominated for Best Book said, "Why is it nominated for Best Book? There's no dialogue in that show." And I thought,
Rick, you mentioned the big idea. What was the big idea behind Jersey Boys?
Well, I suppose the first big idea was not to do what we were asked to think about, which was sort of the Mamma Mia gag with Four Seasons songs. The Mamma Mia had just opened. It was a huge hit. And it was, of course, a fictional story retrofitted around a song list. And, so in that way that some producers feel the herding instinct, I got a call and about doing Mamma Mia with the Four Seasons songs. And I called my friend Marshall Brickman, to whom I owed so much money in poker losses that I thought I could wipe the slate clean if I dangled a project. Okay. So the two of us had a fateful lunch with Frankie Valli, the front man of the Four Seasons, and Bob Gaudio, the principal songwriter and one of the original quartet, in the back of an Italian restaurant on 46th Street, naturally. And while we were waiting for the food to come, and by way of making conversation with two strangers, we said, "So what was it like being you growing up in, wherever it was you grew up?" And by the time the Caesar salad had arrived, they had told us so many interesting things about their lives. And we found ourselves leaning forward the way audiences do when they're told a good story, or the way people do around the campfire when you're telling a good story. We said, forget this Mamma Mia thing. This is an interesting idea. So I suppose that was kind of the eureka moment. The second big eureka moment was when we were talking to the third surviving member of the original quartet, who said, don't listen to Frankie and Bob, I'll tell you what really happened. And we were both on this is me doing my phone mime, because I took mime at Yale Drama School. We were on the phone at opposite ends of a room in Marshall's apartment, and we looked up at each other. That was the real light bulb moment, because in that moment we realized we had been struggling over which perspective of events would we include and which would we discount. In other words, who's telling the true story? And here was somebody who said, I'll tell you the true story. And suddenly we realized, well, there is no true story. You ask four guys what happened, you're going to get at least 4 versions. It's sometimes 17 versions of the same thing. And then it became fun, because we were freed up structurally to introduce the notion of 4 versions of each story, 4 versions, 4 seasons. Mother Nature provided us with 4 seasons. Oh, okay, so we could assign a musician to each of Mother Nature's 4 seasons and track in a lovely way the birth of the group, spring, the full blossom of success, summer, the dissolution of the original quartet, fall, and then the winter of Frankie's discontent, as it were. And so that moment when Tommy DeVito, who just passed away from COVID a couple of months ago, said, "Don't listen to them. I'll tell you what really happened." That was I think the big revelation moment for us.
They were alive, with the exception of Nick Massey, I believe, were alive when. Did you have to dismiss the fact that you were dealing with real life legends and just treat them as characters?
Yes, that was easier for us than it was for Frank and Bob and Tommy, who were saying the things that one says. That's not what really happened. That's not what I was really wearing. That's not really what I said. That's not where it took place. And we kept taking the position of dramatists rather than journalists. We weren't making a documentary. Aaron Sorkin, who is not late, but certainly great, said, art isn't about what actually happened. It's about what you do with what happened to tell a wonderful story. And that became our argument to them. And it was a constant negotiation until we finally got to the point where we were no longer making changes to the show.
Decades later, you came across another existing life and an existing songbook, and that was The Cher Show. What did you learn on Jersey Boys that you could apply to The Cher Show, and how was it different?
Well, I remember at the very beginning, I didn't think that I was the right person to write The Cher Show, and certainly Jesse Green would agree with you, it turned out. But I was at a very vulnerable point in my life. My husband was dying, and I was spending all my waking hours caring for him. And in the midst of all of that, the phone rang one day, and it was Cher. And of course, I thought it was Christian Borle, doing Cher, which sometimes he probably does in the privacy of his own home. But it was actually Cher, and she had been given my number by this lovely fellow named Floaty Suarez, who had the rights to her story and wanted to do a Broadway musical. And she said, "I want you to write the show." And I said, "I don't think I'm the right person to do it. Let me give you Harvey Fierstein's phone number, because, or some other phone numbers. I've got a lot of them." And she, it was sort of, I think it was a little bit like when you're interested in dating somebody and they say, "I'm not interested," it just makes you want to date them more. Sadly for Cher, she didn't take no for an answer. And then when Roger died, she was so sweet and friendly. Like she said, I know what's happened. I've been following it in the press. It was a couple of months had gone by, and I literally hadn't been out of this room that I'm sitting in I was well on my way to becoming, Mr. Havisham, I guess. And she said, it's time for you to rejoin the human race. And I said, Cher, are you actually quoting Thornton Wilder? And she said, no, I'm quoting Hello, Dolly. And I laughed, and it was the first time I had laughed in a couple of months. And she said, I want you to get on a plane and come out here. Let's spend some time together and become friends. And then if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. So I did. And we bonded over loss. We talked about Sonny, we talked about Roger, we talked about what it was like to try to find life after love, which, not for nothing, is the lyrical thrust of probably her biggest hit. And she was very knowledgeable about cinema. So I said, here's what I want to do. I want to do the Terry Gilliam variety show of your life.
Uh-huh.
Said, that sounds great. And then I went back to the hotel and I thought, now what the hell is the Terry Gilliam variety show? What does that even mean? I was just shutting my mouth off. And I wrote a draft that was the Terry Gilliam variety show of her life, where all the events of her life were dramatized as though they were sketches on the Sonny and Cher show or the Cher show. She being so well known as a variety artist on television. So, and that was the script that the producers got excited about. But then little by little, in spite of the fact that I said, here's what you're going to say. That's not what really happened. That's not what I really did. That's not where it really was. That's not what I really wore. And I'm going to say, it doesn't matter. I'm trying to tell a really good story. And she said, I know. But what happened over time was it became untenable for her to not be authentic. Now, Patrick, because you're a great scholar, that Artaud drew the distinction between authenticity and authenticity in the theater.
Uh-huh.
Right. Does The Lion King feel authentically African? It must, because it's been playing for 24 years. Right. And nobody pointed at it and shouted fraud. Did Julie Taymor go to Africa before she designed it? No, she did not. Mm-hmm. And it may not, in fact, be authentic, but it feels authentic, and that's what counts, and that's part of the reason why it's successful. And that distinction sometimes is hard for people to wrap their heads around. So over time, we encountered some friction, she and I, and the show and Cher.
Which gets back to Peter Stone's admonition that writing is through tantrum. And
negotiating through tantrum, yeah. Yes, it's true. But I always thought that meant that was supposed to be my tantrum.
Rick, you also wrote, obviously, you wrote and you are writing two shows that are based on television. One was The Addams Family, and the other one that you're writing now is Smash. When it comes to writing things that were written for one medium, television, and now you have to make it quote unquote theatrical, and as you said, authenticity in the theater, what's the most crucial thing to do?
Well, I hate to be contrary, and you're always so brilliantly prepared, but actually, let me make a distinction. We wrote The Addams Family, we being Marshall Brickman and Andrew Lippa and I, wrote The Addams Family specifically inspired by the New Yorker cartoons and not the television series. So we kind of steered clear of the television series and didn't remind ourselves of it. I mean, of course, we remembered it from when it was on television, but we didn't go and look at the TV show. The challenge, therefore, for Addams Family came to be, how do you take something that exists in a frame, like this frame that we're looking at each other on now, except it's a static frame. Nothing comes before, nothing comes after. So you can have a cartoon where a little Pugsley looking up at his mom, Morticia, with a sad little face. And in the corner, off to the side, is Wednesday peeking out from behind a door with a mischievous grin on her face. And the caption is from Morticia saying, well, you go poison her right back. And I thought, okay, it's wonderful. It makes me laugh. But if you actually play it out, then you think, well, what would happen if he did? Can Wednesday be poisoned? Does Wednesday die? Can the Addams Family die? If they can't die, what are they? Are they creatures of the night? Are they just human beings sort of pushed a little bit past your typical fairway customer, who's just you're a very kind of extreme New Yorker of, this is who I am and this is what I care about, or not. Those questions became very interesting, philosophical, Talmudic almost, until our brains started to dry up like old grapefruits. But the idea of what we could do and what we couldn't do was from Charles Addams, who had sort of written the rule book of the Addams inversion. With as far as Smash is concerned, the approach, I'm writing it with the great, not late Bob Martin, and Mark Shaman and Scott Whitman, of course, have written a trove of songs. But we are just using the television show as sort of a touchstone, but it is not. It's not like another episode of the television show. Or a special holiday episode of the television show. It's taking the idea of Smash and going in a direction that's, we hope and trust will be so wildly entertaining that people will split their sides.
How many songs will be that were in the television show remain in your show, and how many new songs are being written?
I'm not sure how many new songs will be written, but there'll be, big, sumptuous musical numbers of all shapes and sizes and styles in the show. Most of them will be from the series, and it's likely that at some point Mark and Scott will say, "Oh, you know what we need to do is we need to eat this scene and write a number."
We should say that Bob Martin, of course, wrote the delightful book to The Drowsy Chaperone.
Well, you should if he were here, but he's not here, so the hell with him.
And Andrew Lippa, of course, wrote the score to The Addams Family. How much discussion was there among the creators of The Addams Family, whether to include the iconic vamp, which might set up expectations for what's to come?
Marshall and I are just so exquisitely original that, of course, we weren't interested in it at all. It came, shall we say, at a price. I don't mean simply the cost of licensing that famous song, but the price being, what does it say to an audience in terms of how original you're being if you are standing on the shoulders of the thing that's most famous about the television series, when in fact we weren't thinking about the television series. Andrew sort of fell somewhere between our exquisite position, and I don't say exquisite as if it's without flaw, and inserting the song somewhere. So he decided to quote the famous song, within the overture of the show, and get it out of the way, as if it was to let the audience know you're in good hands. And now forget that because we want you to concentrate on this. So it was Andrew who figured out the middle ground in the way that, perhaps Joe Biden will figure it out.
The book writer is always the first to be blamed, last to be praised. Why do you keep at it? Why do you keep doing it?
Well, masochism, obviously. I had such a happy life until I was, in my late 40s, and then decided to go in for some real misery. I can only answer for myself, since there's no one else here. The reason that I do it is I saw my first Broadway show when I was 3 years old. Grew up here in Manhattan. My mother took my older brother and me to see My Fair Lady when I was 3 years old. And she said it was the first time in the first 3 years of my life that I had ever shut up. And I was, so clearly she knew before I did that the theater landed on me in a way that it did not, for example, on my older brother. And it does not for a lot of people, but I've always been enchanted, literally enchanted by it. And the idea of getting to be one of the people who makes these things is thrilling to me. Now, I've held almost every job you can hold in the theater. I've swept the stage, I've worked the light board, I've choreographed, I've acted and sung and danced, I've directed, I've understudied, I've stage managed, I've I've been the doorman. Any job. And then I worked in advertising where I did the advertising for 300 and some odd musicals and plays. The theater has always been my meat and drink. So the idea of actually being part of something in a organic way is thrilling. And if it means getting most of the blame and the least credit, that's just fine. Because it also means that when I go through a stage door, instead of the guy saying, "Excuse me, what are you doing here? Please go away," the guy says, "Hey, Rick, how are you?" Or usually, "Hey, Ron," and I go, "It's Rick." He goes, "Oh, sorry, Rick. How are you?" And I get to continue, and I get to sit in the dark and watch this thing happen, and stand in the back of a theater and listen to an audience laugh at a line that I've constructed. It's the greatest. That's the greatest credit in the world. So the rest of it doesn't really matter.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rick, for beautifully and bravely coming to life musical theater and proving to us that there is life after loss. Thank you so much for this stimulating conversation.
Thanks. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot to me, and I'm glad I got dressed up for you. Thanks for including me.
And thank you for joining us. We look forward to bringing you more fascinating conversations with artists and thought leaders as New York theater, that fabulous invalid, regains its invaluable place in American culture. I'm Patrick Pacheco.